Welcome to the Game Dev Local podcast, a community of game designers, developers, people who love the making of games. And we have a journey that I'm going on. I'm on a podquest to learn everything you wanted to know about game dev, but never dared to ask. And today I am joined by Graham. Graham, tell us a little bit about yourself and your background.
Oscar, hello. So my name's Graham McAllister. I'm an organizational psychologist. We'll get into that. And I focus on one specific problem in game development, and that is the problem of game vision.
We need to define this, but before we do that, for the context of everyone, so when we first met, your focus was primarily around kind of like the usability and testing. Now, I think it's very much grounded in the problem you're describing, but I'm used to sort of you looking at the behavioral processes of players engaging with different games and helping designers in particular, but the teams in more generally understanding how players understood their games. Is that a fairly reasonable way of defining it?
Yeah, so previously I was the founder of a studio which did player psychology, you might say. So is your game good? If a game
Yeah.
designer or a game studio had that question, we've made a thing, how are players experiencing that? That's what my company would have done. And you're right that usability is kind of one half to that solution, which is often thought of as barriers to enjoyment. And the other half is it actually enjoyable? Once you get past the friction points, is the game any good? So it's mostly around what does science know about the studying of how do we know if a game is actually being enjoyed the way people experience? But I left that career, which is what the dots you're talking about here, which is, well, what's the link between player psychology and game vision? So game vision's mostly a team psychology problem because it's a team who work on a game. But the reason I saw that problem was in my previous career. So we worked on, let's say, anywhere from 50 to 100 different titles per year. But I was speaking to around 400 studios a year. So I'd speak to around 4 times as many game studios as we actually worked on. And I got to ask these basic questions a lot across the game industry. What are you making and who is it for? So if you're running a usability test or a UX play test, you need to know those things. What are you making? Because who do I bring in to play the game, right? But guess what I found out? People were really bad at explaining what their game was, and even worse at explaining who their game was for. And I always found that fascinating. So I sold the company about almost 10 years ago now, and I returned to this question of, well, why don't they know that? How come I go into a studio and they find it really difficult to what appears to be a simple question? What are you making? And this other simple question, and who is it for?
Yeah.
And what I realize is depending on who you ask, you get different answers to those questions, which is ultimately disrupting the team.
No, exactly. And this is such a common problem. And so in the sort of work that we've done with accelerated programs, try to help teams sort of like pitch their game to publishers or whatever, or to understand the purpose of their business. Understanding what success looks is the language that we've tended to use. But essentially underneath that is, what are you making and who's it for? Yeah. And it even goes as far as back in the day, I've said this many times, one of my favorite lines, my first day in marketing training, my diploma in marketing was, what is marketing? Marketing is identify and satisfy consumer needs. And I can't think of a better way of describing your problem than that. We are trying to say what it is you're trying to make, what problem we're trying to solve. I use the word problem. I'm not a ramble now.
No,
but
you should call it problem. It is problematizing. Yeah. You can problematize this. Yeah, for sure. And people shy away from that word, but you're correct to do that, I think.
And because it's a game, it's not a problem. It's an entertainment, but that's still a problem for the. So let's take this vision thing. So what I think you're picturing is this. There's a team problem, there's a vision problem, there's a delivery problem that all arises around this fundamental concept. What the heck are we building this for? How do you help people answer that?
So how geeky can we get in this podcast?
We can get so geeky. This is the geek podcast.
So I asked, so this is psychology geeky. So I mentioned I'm an organizational psychologist. And what that means is that's the branch of psychology that deals with team performance. So if you've got one team, regardless if it's in the game industry or not, organizational psychology says, well, what would a good team be doing and what would a bad team be doing? And what should you be doing to increase the chances of success? So it's worth getting these ground rules out of the way that, first of all, that's the type of lens I'm coming at here, which is I'm studying team. This is a team problem.
Mm.
There is an individual component, and I think we're going to touch on that with vision. So then you get to the question, well, if you do ask that question, what makes a successful team? If you ask that to the game industry, as I've done to many CEOs over the years, I'm sure you have too,
Yeah.
what I found surprising is no one has ever given me the answer vision, team vision. What's normally the answer is something related to talent or experience or something that an individual has. And spoiler alert, there's no evidence for that pretty much, it's weak at best. So there is some evidence that being better at your domain specific knowledge can be useful, but it's usually beaten to a pulp by things like vision and culture. So even if you're lucky enough to recruit the world's experts and put them all in one team, there's no evidence that they'll perform well unless they have, so you'd say team and culture, there's some sciencey word for these. So vision we could call mental model or shared mental models. We'll maybe get into it.
Yeah. Oh, we
Team
definitely
coming
want to
to
get into it.
yeah. And then for teams, you've got things like teamwork and task work. So task work
Yeah.
is where are we going? Are we all focusing on the same task?
Yeah.
Teamwork is do we know each other well enough so that when we go on that journey for the same task, that we can work well together? So you've already got these different terminologies, task work and teamwork. And task work is vision, and teamwork is broadly speaking fits into the culture component of
Culture,
that.
yeah. And
Yeah.
I had a conversation with Simon Sparks about culture recently, which I think is very relevant to that. The kind of language I'd like to use when I'm describing where these two things merge together is the idea that the group that we're in. So even if you are an indie developer, and I'm sure there are lots of people who are indie developers out there, maybe one or two people, you still got to have a sense of common endeavor. And to my mind, that gelling of common endeavor is kind of underlying the cement of what you're describing.
It's even stronger than that. So this deeply links to creativity. Even if you're a developer of one, the quality. So I make this clear: I am not a creativity researcher. I research game vision almost exclusively, right? So, however, there's this idea called centrality, and centrality means some ideas are more centrality than others. And if you're wondering how come vision and culture are at the top of any list of a high-performing team, one of the reasons is they're high in centrality. So making the most out of people, everything points to that basically. No matter what you look at, it always comes back to, do you know what you're doing and how do you get there? So that's why they're always at the top of the list, and things like how good you are at your craft, your experience, they're really, really far down the list. And by the way, words like world's expert are never mentioned. They never come up. The word that actually is used is competent. So this idea...
we strive to be basically competent.
Well, you should, because they're not we're not reaching that at the moment. They're actually focusing on the wrong thing. By striving for excellence in the world's best, it means they're taking their attention off the things that are going to make those teams successful.
So one of the reasons why I used the word common endeavor is because I think, and by the way, this is me splitting hairs because I'm interested in your take on it, is I think what you're describing, that centrality is really important, because I think what it provides is the ability to not just know what I'm supposed to do now, but to know the direction upon which it goes. And the reason I think that's so important is because to me, vision isn't a scalar thing. It's not a pillar. I think pillars are bad ideas personally. I think the visions are vectors. They are directions. They allow us to see where we're going on the map, not just where we are. Does that make sense?
It makes complete sense. That is what it is. So it's a direction, and it's also a boundary. So it tells you where you're not going.
Yes.
So and we're going to get some more terms for you. So we're going to get into mental models, which is how you think. And one of the properties of a mental model, and there's lots of properties of these mental models, but one of them is called accuracy. And this is one of the issues the game industry suffers from, where some people may tell me, well, I'm very good at game vision. It's one of my strengths. People have said things like this. And it's not really true. And the reason it's not really true, there's lots of reasons why it's probably not true. But one of them is this accuracy problem where they can only really describe what's going on at a very superficial level. And that superficiality usually is something visual, where they will usually describe the world it's in, and then they'll jump to a mechanic or a feature, something visual. But whenever you get to something which is more accurate, something more interesting, which is why are you making those features? What's the player experience? Back to my previous career. They cannot do that at an accurate level. And they jump to something vague like an emotion or, well, it's interesting, it's tense, it's exciting, it's unique. And this is where the problem comes in, that the vision they're talking about, there's multiple problems here, actually. One is
Yeah.
it's not accurate. So they're not actually describing it from a player perspective. But the other one, it's actually the antithesis almost of creativity. So I started to say that I'm not a creativity researcher, I'm a vision researcher. But whenever you do talk about the intersection of vision and creativity, the way the game industry actually expresses their vision is the way any creativity researcher would say to not do it. So whenever you get, which baffled me, because I thought, well, surely these game designers, if that's their expertise and they're all experts, surely they research creativity to get the most out of their natural, the ideas they come up with,
There's
which
some
doesn't
great
appear to be
folks out
true,
there
by
to
the
listen
way.
to. Yeah.
So any of the research on creativity I have read says you need to describe the problem and not the solution. But
Yes.
when I looked into the
Absolutely.
mental models of game creators, the research I was doing at London School of Economics, which leads to us talking about this, everyone described the solution. They talked about the features they're making in the world. They immediately bypassed the problem
Yeah.
and went straight into the solution space known as the form.
Yeah.
And I was looking for evidence when I was building these mental models. Again, we can get really nerdy on this.
Mm.
When I was building their mental models, I was looking for evidence to how accurate and what they're called cues, what is inside their mind when they form the problem that they're working on.
Yeah.
And there was almost nothing in there. They bypassed the whole area because it's difficult and jumped to the solution. But we're building stuff. But then you ask, well, why are you building it? What's again back to this question? Why are you building? Not much going on at that
So
point.
I do wonder, because I think there's some language you used there I thought was really interesting earlier on. In particular, I'm going to use the word theory. So
Okay.
when you commonly use the word theory, we think it's something hypothetical. When you take the scientific principle of what a theory is, it is something demonstrable
It's
that
exactly
allows
that.
us
It's
to
practical.
predict. Yeah.
So,
And I think this gap that you're describing about accuracy is
mm,
intrinsically implied in that difference, that scientific method, which
yeah,
I do not think is anything at odds with creativity at all,
not at
far from
all.
it,
Not at all.
versus the instinctive approach. Now, I don't think there's anything wrong with instinctive approaches, but if we want to have successful experiences that are going to be enjoyed by people who are not us,
Hmm.
we have to be able to separate ourselves from our instinctive response to being able to test, measure,
Yeah.
understand,
And,
and predict what someone might do.
and oddly, that's one of the main properties of a mental model is they're used
Mm.
for not only defining what you're making, but
Yeah,
being, so it's called running the model because you've got an
yeah,
accurate, if you had an accurate model, you could run it and then predict the future. The
yeah,
people who don't have accurate models, one of the reasons we make mistakes is your model is wrong. So when you
yeah,
predict the future, you were running the wrong model. So surprise, surprise, you got the wrong outcome. So there's a direct link between the quality of your model, how you think, and the quality of the idea. And this is back to creativity research. Very clear, not my area, but whenever you have do it, so these are the fundamental mistakes most of the game industry is making when they define the vision for their game. Problem number one, they're bypassing the context, what is to be made, and they're jumping into the solution. And because their mental model is missing that, they keep. Why do we have so many clones and so many of the same ideas? One of the reasons is their mental models are the same. So I interviewed people all around the world in different regions, and my job was to extract their mental model. What's inside your mind when you think of game ideas, whenever you communicate game ideas? And they all think kind of the same. They're all using the same things. So surprise, surprise, what happens if people are using the same information to generate ideas? They kind of get the same result. So if you wanted to
no,
be more
exactly.
creative, you need a better mental model. And I was looking
And I
for
think,
evidence. Do you have
yeah,
one?
no,
Yeah, yeah.
and I think we see this all the time. Like,
Hmm.
if you spend time, with game teams, they will often describe their games as it's I don't know, Skyrim meets Grand Theft Auto. I mean, obviously
Yeah.
that's a crazy idea. I could probably work out what a game is out of something like that, but I don't think I can work out why the game is
Yes. Exactly
from that
that.
principle. And I think, yeah, so that's what we're talking about here. Is it's the
And
why, not that,
it's why.
not the what.
Yeah. Most people are talking about the how. So when I interviewed people, they said things like, our studio views it as a production problem. Like they can see what they're going to be making for the next 3 years. But when
Yeah,
I ask, why are you making it? What's the player experience? I don't know. It's a
Well, I
strange.
think I find that they think they know what the player experience is because they're thinking about a game that they've previously played that they want to be like, not why that game
And
existed.
let's talk about so that what you just said in the previous
Yeah,
thing, Skyrim
yeah,
crossed with Grand Theft Auto.
yeah,
So that's a known research problem. That's called
yeah,
prototype theory or
yeah,
naive physics. It's got different names, right? So this people have looked into that exact problem and said, well, if people have a difficult, why are you using that theory? Why can't you
yeah,
describe your own product, and why do you need to describe it as something else? And one of the reasons, obviously, is well, they can't describe their own. So they kick the can further down the street and say, well, I can't tell you what my game is, but I'll point to this other thing in the hope that magically the experience somehow comes out, which obviously it doesn't work, and it's known not to work for decades. There's loads
yeah.
of problems with it, and still it's a common way of explaining. So that shows me that the game industry isn't even looking at previous findings. Like,
I
is this
will.
good what I'm doing?
Yeah,
It's
yeah, yeah.
known not to work. It's been known not to work for
No, not to
decades.
worry for you. But I will defend it slightly. I think there are some circumstances where it's useful, and only where it's a shorthand. But you've got to be able to back it up, and the only reason you use it as shorthand, in my view, is when you're talking to another designer, and then you can then go into detail about the emotional levers that you're trying to press
so
and
my
why, purpose, progression, all that kind of stuff.
So my counteraction would be
Yeah,
don't do that at all. Just
I
get
think
good
that's
at
fair.
describing your own game. Because you're starting to the people who did that, so the people I interviewed who did use prototype theory, the
Yeah,
problem is they're what they take from that game is either the features or systems, so that you're
yeah,
getting closer to copying, or vague emotional states. It's the excitement of Grand Theft Auto. What on earth does that mean? How on earth do I implement that? So again, I was delving down into people's mental models. So when
yeah,
they used that approach, which a lot of them did, and my job was to go deeper and deeper to find the limits of their knowledge. So I would say, well, how did you interpret those words? And they're like, we can't. Everybody in our team interprets that in a different way.
oh
So,
dear.
again, they think they're solving the problem by referencing other things. And other problems are such that other people have to have played those games and understood them and had the same interpretation that you have. Because if you're
Absolutely.
saying it's like the excitement of Grand Theft Auto, what do you mean? The excitement you had or the excitement I had? Because they might be different.
Hmm.
So more technical terms if the
Well,
audience like this. Oh, God.
one of my favorite examples of this is I was talking to one of the guys who works on Polytopia, one of my favorite mobile games. And I was saying how I loved it because of the relaxing, sedative state I get into when I'm playing at a extended period of time. And he looked at me like, oh, you're one of those. Because most people apparently play it in a really competitive and head first and like a multiplayer smash against
so
each other kind of
so
model.
you're getting
Yeah,
into we're going deeper here. You're
yeah, yeah,
quite right. So the obviously the drawbacks of using these very primitive basic methods which haven't worked, relying on features or emotional states, they're highly open to
yeah,
interpretation. So when you get into shared mental models, which is the thing inside your head, and I have to tell that to somebody else on my team because we're making the same game, you have to be able to articulate exactly what's going on. And
mm,
that's what we're touching on. We can't do that. We're very bad at that.
mm,
And also, games are not made up of one experience. That it's entirely possible for someone to be like you,
mm,
playing the game to be relaxed, but somebody else could play a game and be competitive, or play it to completion, or for some other
yeah,
purpose. So this idea, back to the many, many problems of prototype theory or naive physics, which is, oh, it's like that other game. Well, which bit of it? Who is our audience? Because we can make this in multiple ways. In
yeah,
fact, we can choose all of the ways if we want, but
mm,
we need to be able to articulate that. When I was looking at the articulation of vision, which is what it's called, my job was to try and figure out how accurate. What are you using to be accurate in this vision? So it's called
mm.
sense giving. When I tell someone the vision that I have, I'm going to do a good job.
So
And
let's frame that then. So, I mean, I think this is a really kind of, I am sure I have the same similar problems, but when I'm talking about emotional processes, I tend to break a game up into kind of layers. So I've got a core loop, I've got a context loop, I've got a cultural loop. The reason I do that is because I'm trying to tell a narrative as I get you to use a mechanic. And I'm thinking about how a mechanic goes from you setting the conditions to you doing the interaction, you getting the reward, that kind of thinking about that flow and how that feeds narratively at a level. Similarly, at the next level, I'm thinking about the purpose of the the player's experience, how we demonstrate their progression of that experience, how we unlock optimization and narrative. All these kind of layers and flows I'm using as a structure to help me understand
Mhm.
what I want the player experience to deliver, and how do I make sure that it solves some problems like why you're playing, why you're coming back, what you're getting out of continuing to come back. And also, in the end, repeatability, which is key to the kind of design that I tend to get involved in. Now, that I understand, but that's not describing a game.
No, that's a very
When you're
machine
helping,
metaphor.
it's a
Yeah,
very machine metaphor intentionally,
yeah,
because I'm
yes,
trying to
yeah.
separate the machinery
Hmm.
from the experience,
So
and
that's all
that's
the
intentional.
solution.
Yeah,
Sorry to
exactly.
interrupt.
Yes.
I think there's a
Yeah,
good, interesting distinction here. And we had a
yeah,
quick pre-chat before the call, and I said
yeah,
there's one interesting distinction that
yeah,
I've been thinking about a lot recently. And game vision, and we haven't defined it yet, by the way. I know,
yeah.
but game vision is mostly. Well, I would make the argument, or science would make the argument, it's mostly a psychology problem.
Yes.
The execution of a game vision is a game
Yeah.
design problem, which is everything you
Absolutely.
just. That's where the machinery has enormous
That's what
value,
I'm talking about.
and
Yeah,
that's where
yeah,
you need it.
yeah,
But the
yeah.
question that comes before the machinery is, why are you making the machinery? I can see you're
Yes.
building the stuff and the loops and the blah 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 the
Mm-hmm.
things. It's not. That's not the problem teams have. They want to know why are we making that, and that's where player experience sits.
Yeah.
The machinery is to serve an experience, and everybody I talked to could describe the machinery. There was no issues there.
Yeah.
But when I asked the seemingly simple question, what experience does that serve? It went very quiet.
And it's really fundamental to your very point, because I want to understand the difference between this, like, how
Mm,
I feel, because we talked about emotion being a bit
mm,
vague. I don't necessarily
yeah,
think it has to be, but I think you're right. 9 times out of 10 it is. But if we're going to have an art team creating the visual parts of an experience, or the animation parts of an experience, and it doesn't match and resonate with the delivery that the mechanics
mm,
delivers, that emotional connection that the mechanics do. If it doesn't connect with a narrative arc, if it doesn't connect with the presentation of the experience
mm,
overall, the audio, whatever else, the acting, all the bits that go into a game, they need that connective tissue, and it's the vision, I presume, that you're
yeah,
describing, which provides that sense of commonality between these components.
yeah. It's being as accurate as possible.
Mm.
What do all the components serve? Everything comes back
Yeah.
to these components, this central vision.
Mm.
And basically, this question, which has largely gone unanswered, again, I'm trying to make the argument that it's gone unanswered because the answer does not come from game design. That's the other half of the solution, the
Mm. Mm.
execution. Game vision is it's psychology, and there's two forms of psychology. One is, well, you're making a game for a player, so it's partly that player psychology. Because if the game doesn't resonate, like I posted on LinkedIn a few weeks, I think you saw it. It's common for a lot of game creators when the game is cancelled or shuttered, they say our game didn't find an audience, or our game failed to resonate, or something like that.
Yeah.
Insert
Yeah.
euphemism here. What that means is, I would argue, the vision of the player was not captured in their vision. I think
Yeah.
they had the machine metaphor. We're going to build a collection of things, and our hope is that when they come together, that is fun. And it didn't work
And
out.
hope is not a strategy.
Exactly. And hope is
It's
not
my
a
favorite
strategy.
line. Yeah.
And that's what I was trying to prove out in my London School of Economics research is there any evidence of the player in your vision? And there's not, at least not on a meaningful level. It's superficial. It's not, I mean,
And
we'll get into the details of this, but so that's the root problem is you're right that all these features and systems are meant to serve
yeah.
the player. But however, that's only the first type of psychology because if a team is making a game, once we know the experience we have to make, you have to describe that to the whole team. And that's why it's an organizational psychology problem. Even if the creator, say one person comes up with an idea for a game, so that process is known as sense making. They make sense of the bits of information they have. I think I can take A, B, C, and D to create an experience. Brilliant. That's $1 billion idea. Now, hang on, I can't make that myself. I need to tell this team of 100 people what was inside my head. That's why it's a mental model problem.
Mm.
So going from mental model to shared mental model means you're telling it to someone. The sense maker, here's my idea, has to sense give. I have to give you my idea and persuade you that this is worth making. Now, the problem is, we're going to look back here. If you've got an inaccurate mental model, If how you think of it and describe it is not accurate, you cannot transmit it. It is simply not possible. That's why the psychology comes in. And that's why often you see a creative director getting frustrated. They can see it in their mind, maybe, what they want to make. However, their own mental model is not accurate enough for them to give that vision to the rest of the team. And when I interviewed people, I heard many, they're all anonymized and confidential, but so I can't reveal anything specific, but multiple people told stories like people would repeat things like, why don't they get it? I've told them before what the game is. Why don't they get it? And those are teams who think people are machines. Like, I've told them once, what's the problem? And the problem is they don't understand people. They don't understand that our mental models are different. And that when I tell someone that it's called your frame of reference, they're conflicting. Some people think like, let's say A, and some people think like Z. And the assumption is that whenever I told them the vision, that they understood it perfectly. And that just does not happen. In fact, I designed a previous thing called the vision alignment check, and I ran that exercise around the world 80 times now. And it's changed over the years, but the idea is basically the same. I deconstruct the mental model. It's the opposite. Instead of forming a vision, I take the vision out of people's heads on a team, and then we see the variation. And I've done that 80 times around the world, from the number one games in the world down to games you've never heard of. No team has been aligned. Never happened. It's a human problem. It does not matter how much experience you have in the game industry or what your people are different. And a team is made up of different roles, such as people who are on the creative element, I'm going to make a game, and someone who's in marketing, I have to position the game in the market, and someone who's maybe talking about the player, how many people can we address, and the company, this is going to move our company from a small indie studio into the AA market or AA to AAA. There's ambitions for the studio. How you see the vision in each of those cases is completely different, even if you're in the same room, hearing the same thing.
And the thing that I find fascinating about it is when we use this vision principle, we're tuning in these different perspectives to magnify the output. So I think the
Correct.
diversity of opinion magnifies the output when it's aligned.
Correct.
And we end up diminishing the experience when we try to, constrict it and not let people fill the gaps, if that makes sense. But without that vision, how do you get that alignment? How does that not end up as noise?
So pleased you mentioned that. One of the words that I find myself thinking about a lot is amplifier. And the reason why vision is an amplifier is the obvious one is direction. You've got a clear direction. That's the given one. But then in my interviews, people talked a lot about motivation at work. Because of the way the vision was expressed, they said they would come into work in the morning and they were just told to work on something. There's no creativity. It's just, well, production says we're making the thing, make the thing. Whereas if the vision had been expressed as the problem, what are we making? What is to be made? That's interesting, right? Well, I can see a way to solve that problem. Like someone said something like, they hired me because I was creative, and then they took it all away from me. And
you say someone. That's about 90% of game designers.
Yeah. Correct. I was just about to add, it wasn't one person, it was multiple people.
Yeah.
And this comes back to vision. This is why vision is an amplifier. At a very primitive level, people say, oh, it's about direction, which is true. But then you get into the psychology of vision, which is if you don't have it, what happens to the people on the team? It's not that they just don't know where they're going. It's that they're unmotivated when they get there, and they're uncreative. And when they see their work being thrown away multiple times because it didn't fit the vision, guess what? They don't put their best work into it anymore. Why would they? Because it's going to get thrown out again.
Exactly. What's the point? So, and they're burnt out by the process as well.
Correct.
Quite often.
And their game may not be made, so their CV's got a blank. What did you work on? Well, I can't tell you. It was cancelled and was NDA'd, so I cannot tell you what I worked on.
That's my entire bloody career.
So vision is totally an amplifier across multiple levels,
But I think let's get into some practicality. So for me, as a marketing trained person, my instinct is always to start with the audience, to think about who it is and to define that clearly. And to me, that means not just saying 18 to 25-year-old men, because that's useless. Yes. I want to know something about their psychometrics, or their demographics, something about who they are, what they will do, why they would do those things. And I will often have more than one. I mean, for me personally, back to my mechanical solution part, I try to match a cohort to each of the three layers that I have. So I'll have a primary audience primary audience who I use as the lens when I'm focused on the core mechanics. I'll have a secondary audience who I'll use as a secondary lens for when I'm dealing with the purpose and progression, and a tertiary audience where I'm looking at the kind of cultural social engagement. Now, I do that because of years of practice. I happen to know if I think about a primary audience and use it with clarity, I get a cleaner outcome. But that tends to be people who would be willing to play for that mechanic alone. Whereas if I have a secondary audience, I can scale the audience beyond that first one as long as I don't confuse the experience of the first. So this layered approach I found useful. Am I barking up the wrong? I mean, this is obviously the mechanical part. To get to the point where we start thinking about vision, I'm just talking about the information gathering to get to the stage where we can start communicating. Is that making sense?
So let's talk about that. You mentioned, what I heard you say was, and you're quite right to say, like, demographics are mostly useless. Mostly. So 18 to 25-year-old male does not explain why you're playing the game.
No.
There can be a cultural effect, like Gen Z are more likely to do. So there can be a time component to this, that people were exposed to certain TV series, or, so I'm not going to dismiss that too much, but you're right, it's not the most useful. Behavior is maybe a step up in terms of, well, people who do X, but again, it's not very strong in terms of explaining why they do it. It's more of an outcome driven. Well, if you like collecting all the things, you might like our game. If you like, these types of behaviors, whatever it is. So again, when I was interviewing people, I was not only looking for, is there psychology captured in your game, but is also in your player. And most people stopped at that level. So they would go to demographics and then behaviors. Well, it's people who play this game over here for that reason. And I would say, well, does that work? And they say, well, not really, because it doesn't tell us why they play those games. So then what's missing from those are a couple of things. So I would add things like, well, what do we know about how people work? Well, we maybe have cognition, or there's different words for it. The generic term might be workload. So workload is a generic term that would say, well, there's different things I can do to people. I could max out your brain by having a difficult game, like a 4X game. I could max out your time by giving you Skyrim and saying for the next 1,000 hours, you're going to have no time left. Or it could be dexterity. So there's different things I can do to you in terms of your ability, let's say. So workload has an effect too. And then you get into probably the main one, which is motivations. So ultimately, why are you playing this game? The other one would be preferences. So in my model, like if you want to add accuracy into the target audience, demographics not so useful, behavior kind of useful, but then the more interesting ones are maybe workload or, preferences. Interesting that, although it's interesting, you can't control it. I can't make you like first-person shooters if you don't like first-person shooters.
But as a filter to get to a persona, there's the value. So I will tend to use that demographic and the targetability, the kinds of metrics you'd use for like a Facebook to ad or something. I tend to use them to filter down to a persona, and then I'm looking at what do they think, they say, they feel, and they do to give me a layer. A little bit, no, maybe not quite as low as you're describing, but at least some level of psychology.
And you're quite right that a lot of this is because of the mechanics of the machine of marketing. That's why those measurable things are used. Well, we can target the rage, or we can target behaviors because we know where they go or what they buy or what they interact with. But what all of that is missing is why. And so that's when I increase in my model, when I increase the accuracy of describing the player, what I'm injecting is the psychology of the player and not just the outcomes of what the player, who the player is, which is, I'm not so much interested in behavior or your age or, things like that. It's the things that explain. I'm interested in explaining. I want to get down to the root cause of explaining, why is your game there? Why is the player there? And we can't talk about audience without talking about positioning in the market as well, because in my model, all these things are connected, which is the game you want to make. It's kind of the same answer as to who your audience is. Who would have thought if a game resonates, and this is why I often use the word, sufficiently explanatory or something. Like if you've described your player and it doesn't explain why they're playing your game, you've probably got it wrong. So obviously age doesn't explain why you're playing a game. Behavior, a bit better, but it doesn't explain why you're playing a game. So the flag should be up in your head that clearly these things are not explaining the result that we're seeing. Players are telling me that this game is resonating with them. We can see that because we can measure it. We can measure the behavior. We can measure the sales. But why? Can we get closer to understanding why? And that's the layer I want to get. I prefer people to get to. But again, when they do the market positioning, just to tie these up a little bit as well, when I ask people how they position their game in the market, back to prototype theory, the games they chose would be based on these really crude measures of game, like features or systems or mechanics or genre. Well, we're making a walking simulator, so we looked at other walking simulators, or we're making a match 3, or making an open world game. That's like,
There you go with this, yeah.
Does that, again, back to this sufficiently explanatory, does that explain it? If I like racing games, do I play all racing games? The answer is obviously no. If I like match 3,
people who play Burnout are identical to people who play GT, aren't they?
Of course they are, right? Oh, wait a minute, they're not at all. They're not in any way.
They're not at all.
So again,
I mean, I might as well be playing. I don't know. I mean, I'm trying to think of a stupid example, but you might find that a Burnout player is closer to maybe a Fortnite player.
Oh, that's a GT very on the money.
Player, yeah, that's whereas a GT player might be more interested in what's a more clinical, maybe Tarkov, maybe, where it's much more about being precise.
And so the game industry has these subgenres. Well, we don't mean action racing games. We mean simulation racing games. That'll be their counter argument. But it's just avoiding the problem. It's saying, well, what do you mean specifically about how is that resonating with the player? So they're trying to narrow it down, but it's not sufficient. And
so genre is terrible. We are terrible at defining genre. Yeah.
So we're getting at this accuracy problem. It's got different names. You've got the level or the accuracy. So when people told me they were good at game vision, it was only ever true at a very basic level. Like we could agree on the features of the game or the genre. But whenever we tried to get into being more accurate and adding the psychology into it, spoiler alert, which is why we play games, to feel something, that was absent from everyone's model. And that was true both at the creative level and that I ended up calling it strategic vision. So game vision is actually 2 subvisions. You've got the creative side and the strategic audience and marketing, as you said earlier. Those people...
You're making me think a little bit here about...
oh, no.
So we talked about direction. No, it's good. It's good. You talk about direction. You're talking about understanding the why. And I think there's a connection here between... I'm going to use the hero's journey because it's the one narrative arc that everybody's heard of. Anyone who's watched Star Wars knows what the hero's journey is. But if you think about it, there's something about not just having a why of a player, but that why needs to evolve as they play the game for us to deeply understand what the game experience is. Is that kind of the things you're getting to?
So the evolution over time, it could be the same. So it can be the same. It doesn't necessarily have to change.
No.
You know, there's a lot of games where the same motivators will drive you from beginning to end.
Yeah.
And it's completely satisfying. It's fine. We don't need more systems and more features to increase the enjoyment or anything.
Oh,
like
I'm not saying necessarily more systems and more features,
no,
but I'm thinking about if you think about the flow. I mean, even let's take the 3-act play structure, right? So we've got inciting incident, we've got confrontation, we've got resolution. I mean, that's a relatively simple narrative arc, but there is a narrative arc inherent in it. If we're going to communicate our vision to our team, and we don't know what the equivalent of the game's narrative arc and why these players want that experience, are we really going to get across the game vision?
I probably wouldn't phrase it that way. I think the narrative arc is introducing a problem of time, and it's introducing this idea that something's evolving, which works well for narrative, obviously, but it doesn't have to work well for experience by itself. You can't have the same ones and have other drivers. For example, the narrative could pull you along, but have the same motivational drivers.
Oh, I'm not thinking literal narrative here. Don't get me wrong. I'm not necessarily saying you write this as a story. I'm just saying...
I know what you're getting at. Like, does it change, essentially? You're saying, in the same way that a narrative arc would change.
It's more a case of, I think, we have to... If we're going to understand our vision, if there is a journey, if there is a process, if we're going to truly understand accurately what's going on, I think we have to understand what we're expecting of that player in some form.
So you're jumping to the solution, which is a natural thing to do.
Am I?
Yeah,
I don't
kind
think
of.
I am. I don't. I mean,
Because you
again, maybe
said,
I'm
what's
not
the player?
phrasing it.
You
No, no,
mentioned
no.
the
That's
word
not what I'm
do.
saying. Is
Don't use
no,
the
it's
word
not quite
do.
what I'm
Yeah.
meaning. That's a mistake in my language. Then,
Yeah, say it again. Say it again.
I'm trying to sort of what I'm trying to frame is if we're trying to describe the problem,
Yeah.
we need to understand the impact of our of so what the player we want to create an experience for a player. Okay,
Hmm.
an experience is not, I would argue, static, and
Hmm.
that's kind of what I'm trying to get to.
I see where you're going. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I might be using a frame to use
Yeah.
my example, which is a solution. I like you say,
Yeah. Gotcha.
hero's journey, 3-act play. They're just systems to systematize the process. But I suppose
Yeah.
getting to the hub of it, if we are trying to describe an experience,
Correct.
part of that is understanding the consequence of that experience, I would
Yeah.
argue.
So again, the work in my model, for example,
Yeah.
that's what would happen. You would be
Yeah.
mapping every feature, let's say behavior, what the player is
Yeah.
going to do,
Yeah.
back to something that it explains why it resonates with the player, essentially.
Yes. Yes. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
So that's how it should work. But
Yeah.
the problem should be it looks kind of static, but the
Yeah. Yeah.
implementation of it is dynamic. That's where you've got all the systems and
Yeah.
features
Great.
and
Yeah. That's
changing
cool.
over
Yeah. Good. Good.
time
Good.
and loops
Yeah.
and all the rest of it. And but the
I'm just
experience is
thinking about how do you communicate to a team without them having a sense of that process. And like I say, I don't. Yeah,
yeah.
I'm soaking this up and enjoying it, but
No,
rather than arguing, I'm just literally trying to understand.
no, I like that you push back. This is
Yeah,
interesting. But
yeah,
so you're right. The articulation of the vision. What does it look like? And I said earlier, it kind of the vision that came out is in two subvisions. So you've got
yeah,
creativity and
yeah,
strategy or business. You can call it what you
yeah,
like, but it's basically seeing it as a product. Once you've got a game, who is it for, and where does it sit in the
yeah,
market? And that's what you're trying to articulate. And then you're going to leverage your team and say, if this is the problem to be solved, this is where creativity comes in. So back to Csikszentmihalyi and people like that
yeah,
who are creativity researchers,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
or Christopher Alexander. They're like the ability to describe the problem will almost amplify the quality of the solution. Like if you've got a poor solution, it's probably because the problem wasn't well stated. You're
yes,
you're scrambling about trying to find a solution, but you don't know what you're going towards. So as long as you can, my solution's articulated in mostly player psychology because that's why
yeah,
we're making games. Imagine you're
absolutely,
trying to solve every problem. This problem we talk about with games is rooted in experience. Ultimately, that's
yeah,
what it comes back to. So you're asking a really interesting question. Well, what does the solution look like? And if you see the solution rooted in systems and mechanics, and that's not why we're playing games. That's a
no,
clear sign that we're not on the right track, obviously.
yeah, yeah,
So
yeah,
if you
totally,
go back to the fundamental question, why do we make games? We make games to make people feel a certain way, and we hope that'll sell enough to make a good business. That's kind
yeah,
of what our industry does. So let's talk about the problem. The problem we're trying to address then is experiences. Okay, well, show me your vision. How well have you articulated the experience of that vision? And I
mm,
don't want to see a solution. I don't want to see loops and stuff and things that will be
yeah, yeah,
built. We'll get to that. That's fine. What is the experience you're making, and how did you describe that to the team? And that's what my research was all about. So previous to me doing that, there was no previous research on the mental models of game creators. And by the way, this is really unusual in science. Normally, when
yeah,
you get a scientific problem, you start by doing a literature review, which is saying,
yeah,
what do we know about this thing so far? And I've been a professor before at the University of Sussex in so I've obviously done a lot of research. And it's always the case where you go into a field and you spend years reading what's at hand. There's usually years of research to read.
yeah,
When I looked into how much do we know about how game creators think when they think about their game, so it's a meta problem. What do you think about when you think about your game?
yeah, yeah,
Blank slate, completely empty. Now there's some evidence on players. So the
yeah.
work I was doing, we're trying to publish it at the minute, and my job in 2025 is to write the book on game vision. So we're going to publish it academically, just to lay that down so people will build on it. And then I'll write a slightly more accessible version. It'll still have lots of psychology and nerdy terms.
I'm waiting for my copy now.
No sooner said than done. But it's just to explain to the listeners
Yeah.
that in 2024, 2025, we have nothing to build on. There's lots of opinions on game vision, but that's all
Mm.
it is. People send me papers and things, and it's all opinion. It's just They've had an idea, but that's it. It's not rigorous.
But
There's no
even the
proof.
stuff that we end up quoting, and I'm going to
Mm,
quote Richard Bartle's stuff, and Richard's fantastic. He says the same thing as I'm about to say, which is he did his analysis based on MUDs. He
mm-hmm.
looked at the 4 player types that
In the
came out of the
70s, 80s,
in the
yeah.
70s. Yeah, well,
Yeah.
yeah, it was 80s. Yeah.
80s like it was, yeah.
Um,
Yeah, yeah.
I can't remember. Anyway,
Yeah, I don't
I
know.
remember playing Mud back in the day because I'm that old. In fact, I actually worked very briefly with Richard because we were supporting Mud 2 on Wireplay on dial-up modem back in the late 90s. So, yeah. But the point is that that model is now endlessly quoted as the truth for all games. That you've
Yeah.
got your killers, you've
It's,
got your socializers, explorers.
yeah.
I don't think that's a proper understanding of the motivation of the player.
It was getting close. It's funny when you look at the
Yeah.
timeline. The reason why I think I remember his paper was from the 80s
Hmm.
is he was probably reading other academic. He's an academic, so he was
Yeah.
probably reading other academic research at the time on player motivations, and it came out in the early 80s. So
And it was a
there,
great piece.
yeah,
I'm
yeah,
not trying
yeah.
to dismiss it in any way,
Me neither.
but it's
Not
the
at all.
application that other people have made of it that is questionable.
Yeah, exactly. So,
Hmm.
I mean, those terms, he's trying to get into at least. Well, I've seen people do these things in my game.
Yeah,
Maybe it's applies to other games and things. So
yeah.
you're quite right. It's an under researched area, and I was specifically trying to look at game vision. So he was trying to understand player motivations. And
Player
why are these
motivation, yeah,
people?
yeah.
Why do I see these different behaviors in my game? And that was his explanation for saying, well, maybe people are driven by socializing or achieving or killer exploring. That's fine. And I'm trying to say, well, okay, motivation's a part of this, but I'm applying it to the game vision problem specifically, saying,
Yeah.
well, hang on. If in vision research, outside the game industry and inside, vision comes up as the number one problem to improve your chances of success. And it's
Yeah.
been there for over half a decade. For over 50 years, anyone who looked inside,
Half a century, you mean?
including Hackman's
Yeah,
work as well, and
yeah,
all the results comes back to the same thing, that if you don't know what you're doing, it doesn't matter how experienced and talented your team is, it ain't going to work
yeah.
because they're going in the wrong
Absolutely.
direction. And then culture
Yeah,
as well. So that's what I was trying to say as well. What do we know? What does science have to know about game vision? They don't use that word. They use shared mental models in psychology, but
yeah,
it's the same problem. And the answer was not game specifically, not much. Shared mental models, it's well known in psychology. It's a very, very deep vein of research. I certainly read over 100 papers for my thesis, but I ran out of time. There's thousands of these things, right?
mm,
But it's a very, very, very deep vein of research. And in vision, they thought there's 3 main problems that will apply to the game industry. How do you capture the idea? How do you capture the vision? How do you communicate it? And how
yeah.
do you measure it? How do you know you communicated it?
Yes.
So in that mental model, shared mental model research, that's what they focus on, is how good are you at capturing? How good are you at communicating? How good are you at measuring? And the game industry is pretty poor at all 3 because the fundamental thing's wrong. If it's badly captured, it has to be badly communicated. And
Yeah.
they've no way of measuring, which is why I built that game vision alignment
Well, it's the
checking.
classic garbage in, garbage out. If you're not
Correct.
capturing accurately the thing that you're trying to solve, then how can you communicate anything that's useful?
Exactly. It's
Yeah,
impossible. And that's
yeah.
why things like sense making and sense giving. So I've mentioned these terms, shared mental models. That's half of the
Mm.
solution. You have to go into the other half, which is sense making and sense giving, which is how did I see that information to begin with? And when you put both things together, that's where my research was sitting.
So I love all this, and I think this is fundamental. Let's try and get some practical, because there's going to be some folks on here, I think, starting out in their careers, others who are going to be more experienced like us. How do we give them some practical? So we've talked about getting the basics right, separating the system thinking from the vision gathering, but having some foundational principles upon which you're going to base that vision. But then, end of the day, getting down to the psychology of the recipient and
Yeah.
how we're going to deliver that. Is that how would you summarize it? That's
Yeah, I mean
my
that's what
take.
that's where I want to try.
Yeah,
So let's try and
yeah,
summarize a few takeaways, but whether they're
yeah,
practical or not. Let's try. First thing, that is the level you're trying to get to.
yeah,
Nobody is playing your game for systems and features. They're playing the game for the feeling that those systems and features give them, the
mm,
player experience. So I would not use the word feelings. I don't want to say emotions. That's more the outcome. I want you to get the motivators, which what's driving the
yeah,
emotion. Why are they doing that? The better you get at doing that in general, the better your vision is going to be. Also, if your vision contains systems and features and physical things like world building, that's more solution. Try not to do that, and try to ask the question: why are we making this game? You asked the question at the beginning, which is, what is a vision? We completely
We
ignored
haven't
it.
got anywhere near it.
Very quickly, a vision, there's no
Yeah.
standard definition. That's one thing you should know. However, a vision is sometimes, well, a vision, a state of the future. The reason I don't like the word vision is it's usually visual. You can see it. However, in our industry in particular, you cannot see it because it's an experience. So we are unlike all the other industries that use vision, all these books here. They can use a vision because usually what they're trying to build is something visual, an airplane, a health center. They can see it. Game industry is different in that our output is usually an experience. It's the invisible. So we've got this kind of double, which is why psychology is more interesting, arguably, by the way. So that's one thing. Vision as a future state. It's not just visual in our case. It's actually an experience. It usually should contain what is unique. So why? It's back to this why question. Don't talk about the solution, what you're building. Why are you building it? That's interesting. And it should be compelling. Those are some of the properties of a vision. So if it's like, well, we're going to make another match 3. Does the world need another match 3? Well, it might do if you saw ours. Okay, but you have to explain why.
Yeah. What is it about?
What is it about
your match 3 that solves something new or interesting?
And that definition should be rooted in player psychology. I'm going to make the player feel different, and this is how I'm going to do it. If you can do that, then that's where I would want my model would get people to that level. It's then saying, I know you're building stuff, and I know you're using prototype theory by sounds like these games and that game. None of that is probably not going to help you. It's going to hinder you, if anything, because you're missing the point of why we build and play games. For the player experience.
Now, this is one thing it means I'm going to change a little bit the way I talk about vision myself, because I typically would talk about vision about what success looks like, because I'm talking about vision for a company rather than vision for a game. What does the success look like for you?
Yeah.
And then I get them to put KPIs to those things.
We can get to that
and
level.
From that, we can then describe a direction.
Yeah.
But to me, there's a parallel here, because we're not talking about the vision for the company, we're talking about vision for the game, in which case the ways that we measure, because I still think measurement's a useful factor, will be around how we're taking that player through that experience, or how they're engaging with that experience at some level. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so there is a link as well at the final. So I've got the chapter outline for my game vision book, and at the end I say, let's talk about the company. Because it's important. And there's psychology of this too. So I mentioned there's 2 subvisions, but one controls the other. Usually business controls creativity. For rightly or wrong, that's the way it tends to work out. And there's lots of tensions there. But you're right that once you can express your vision, you will get better at understanding what that's going to do for your company. The reason why, sadly, some companies have closed or the games have been shuttered. So I talked about the ability to run the model. If you've got an accurate model, you get better at predicting the future.
Yeah.
When they ran the model in their head, they ran it incorrectly. So they were taking their business in the wrong direction because what they thought was being made was incorrect. So that's why I start with the game. Once you understand what is being made, you can position it better in the market, and it'll explain who your game is for. Those 3 things combined allow you to position and understand what this is going to do for your company. But you must understand the product first. Because that's how it works.
And again, I think this is where some of the lessons out of the hyper casual world were interesting, because they were building smaller things that they could test earlier and warranty that their vision resonated. I mean, in a very simplified way, obviously. And I think some of those lessons can be applied even to big games, but obviously you're taking bigger and more complicated bets when you're doing that kind of process. So that gets complicated.
I'm not going to mention any names, but there's a current AAA game that came out at the end of last year, and it's not doing terribly well, massively underperformed. And I was reading someone else's analysis of it. They're just no, I'll not say. I was looking at someone else's analysis of it, and they said they felt like they approached it from a very world-building approach. We've got a world, we've got characters, we've got story. And then they said, but the gameplay's a mess. Like, why are we playing this game? So for my model, that's what my research would say too. Everybody I interviewed, when I deconstructed their mental model, they all constructed the visual world. Here's the world, here's the characters, here's the things you're doing in it. But no one really talked about why, at a meaningful level, why the game existed. They couldn't do it. It wasn't in their mental model. It wasn't in their language. And here is let's call them a player for want of a better word. Here is a player saying exactly that when I play the game, they're thinking, they've built a machine, but it's a really boring machine.
Yeah.
Of course it underperformed. It doesn't resonate with the player. And I would imagine if I looked at that game's vision, there's completely devoid of the player. I would imagine it's world building. And
I think you're right.
I would imagine
And
that's the case.
this is one of the key things that whenever I'm trying to teach game design to people, it's the a absolute founding principle is, why should I care?
Why? And the better you get at that question, the more success you will have.
Yeah,
that's the question. That's your mental model. That's a mental model question.
What a perfect place to end on that note, Graham. Thank you very much. So, I mean, if there's any sort of one thing obviously why you should care is probably the thing, but is one thing you would want people to take away from this conversation?
I don't think there is one thing. I think it's multiple things. The fact I'd like people to know that game vision is the leading thing to make your company successful, your game and company successful. And that's been proven out for over 50 years. It's not new. And that's inside the game industry and outside. So that's one thing that, how come when I asked all those CEOs, what do you think makes a successful team? Why did no one say game vision? It means they're not looking at this research. So it's not even on their radar. They keep thinking, well, we just need better people. I've had people tell me that. And there's no evidence for that. That's not. So, it's one thing to say, I know if people listening are from indie studios, that it's maybe slightly different problem, but maybe not.
I don't think it's a different problem. I think it's the same problem. It's, at the end of the day, the indie games that we love have an inherent, delightful, charming, or stressful in the right way, experiential moment that it captivates me. Completely. I mean, I could talk. I'm going to carry on talking.
I was going to say one good example of a vision. People ask what's a good example, and there's one.
Yes, please.
It's from Tears of the Kingdom by Nintendo. So their GDC talk. There's an article online describing it, so it's free to access. But they described it the way I would want them to describe it, almost by describing the problem to be solved. So I'm just going to leave that as homework for your listeners. So,
homework for
by the way, that's deeply rooted in psychology, and I know that they read that type of stuff. So it's not by accident. It is not by accident.
And I think that for me is the lesson. We are playing with psychology. The more we know about it, the better. The more we understand it, the better games that we can make. And I think any game designer out there needs to pay attention to psychology and economics to be able to do better game designs. But then I would say that because I'm writing a book on game economy design at the moment. Anyway, Graham, thank you so much. If anyone wants to get hold of you, what's the best way for them to do that?
It's my website, my name. It's just grahammcallister.com. There's a contact page there. You'll also see some things on my whole books online for free, my previous book. And then there's a bit of blurb on the Game Vision book as well and whatnot. So grahammcallister.com that's the place.
And I can't wait to read the book. Graham, thank you so much. That's been fantastic. And if you've enjoyed this, please like, subscribe, share, tell other people. If you disagree with us, great, get on the Discord and have an argument with us about it. And I think at the end of the day, if we are passionate about game design, we should be passionate about the whys, about what players care about. Because as Graham said, we need to separate our instinctive process from our emotional connection with the player. And I don't mean that in an ambiguous way. I mean that in how we are delivering an experience and what that experience is, and most importantly, why they will care about that experience. And if we fail to be able to answer that question, how can you possibly expect other people in your team to know what to build, let alone how the audience is going to resonate with that game? On that note, thank you very much. This has been your Game Dev Local.